Good evening and welcome to our symposium on Grenada, 10 years later, and U.S. Caribbean policy. We have a very full evening, so I want to go ahead and start and let the introductions be very short so we can get to the main event. And we actually have two main events. We have a first-hand report by students who went to Grenada this summer and participated in the Grenada 10 years later project. And we have a description of this project by Decima Williams, their professor, and Jacob Ziskin, visiting professor of sociology at Brandeis. And we also have a lot of people. After that, the students wanted to showcase and expand upon their experience by inviting Noam Chomsky from MIT to engage in a dialogue with Decima Williams about U.S. Caribbean policy. So let's get going. Before we start, there are a lot of people who've been very supportive in getting the Grenada 10 years later project off the ground. I want to thank in particular the four departments at Brandeis that sponsored this event. That is African and Afro-American Studies, Latin American Studies, the RAB School of Summer Special and Continuing Studies, and the Sociology Department. And to give you a little bit more information on the Grenada 10 years later project, let me turn the podium over to Daniel Terrace, Assistant Provost of the RAB School. Dan?
Thanks, Sylvia. My own involvement with this project has been relatively modest. It began really with Decima Williams's great passion and energy and her research project. She brought it to the summer school, which is a part of the RAB school, and we helped facilitate the ability of students to go down to Grenada and spend several weeks there doing research and participating in the life of that community, learning about its history, and being engaged. To me, this whole project is, in a certain sense, what is most exciting about Brandeis as a university. It combines that sense of passionate social and political engagement with a strong academic and intellectual context for the work. It's very exciting for me and for the RAB School to be part of a program which combines those things, and it's a program that was enormously successful this summer thanks to the energy that Decima and the students that you'll be hearing from brought to it. Just a word of thanks to my Associate Director, Gwen Smaxwell, who worked very hard also to make it happen. I'm as curious as you are to hear the details about their program this summer, and I'm going to let you move on to that. Thank you very much.
And our next speaker, who will provide some information about Grenada, is Carlos Whiteman, who is a Harvard undergraduate and a Grenadian. Carlos?
This will be brief, and it is designed to look back at the revolution, look back at the revolutionary leaders, and sort of get a sense and a feel for what the revolution was all about. It has been 10 years since the dissolution of the Grenada Revolution, 10 years since the murder of the revolutionary leaders, particularly the Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and the other revolutionary leaders. I'd like to read a quote by Maurice Bishop. "There are those who believe that you cannot have a democracy unless there is a situation in which every 5 years, and for 5 seconds in those 5 years, the people are allowed to put an X next to some candidate's name. And for those 5 seconds in those 5 years, they become Democrats. And for the remainder of the time, they return to being non-people, without any right to say anything to their government, without any right to be involved in running their country. We say that when in a particular country, the question of a new health plan has to be formulated, and the people of the country are involved in discussing that policy, and organizations and mechanisms are introduced to ensure that the people will be able to participate in bringing that new policy into existence, we say that is real democracy." Maurice Bishop, March 13, 1980, 1 year after the revolution. Let us now have a moment of silence as we look back to honor our slain revolutionary leaders, and let us look forward to tomorrow, to a day when the right of self-determination of a people will be respected and not undermined by the forces that be. Let's have a moment of silence. Thank you.
And now giving us an overview of the last 10 years is Decima Williams, Ziskin Visiting Professor of Sociology at Brandeis and former ambassador from Grenada to the OAS. Decima?
Either the praying Catholic or the diplomat in me made me stand. Not sure which it was. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. And I want to thank Sylvia Rome for her role in moderating the program this evening. Thank you all for coming. The Grenada 10 Years Later project has to be started in the context of Grenada. And I'll first talk a bit about Grenada and then a bit about the project. The island that we call Grenada is it has both a single and a collective identity. It's known by many different names. Its first name that we remember Grenada by is called Camahone. And that's the name that our first Grenadians called our country before the advent of Columbus. It was a country very much part of the large Caribbean archipelago, where Arawaks, Caribs, and Sibonese people roamed the region in a fleet of naval canoes. And on the arrival of Columbus, it took another 100 more years before European presence would be established on the island. From 1498 until 1650, these fierce Caribbean nationals prevented European settlement until 1650. From then until 1783, the country was occupied by British, French, and British until 1783, when, in a cessation, more or less, of European rivalry on the island, with the Treaty of Paris, Grenada became a British colony and remained so until 1974, well after the wave of independence had swept Africa and Asia. In fact, up until now, there are many English-speaking colonies in the Caribbean. The first wave of independence came in the early 60s with Jamaica and Guyana and Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. And the second wave came in the late 70s. And the third wave actually is ongoing, starting in 1981 with St. Kitts and many other territories still under colonial rule. The 1780s and 1790s were a very fervent organizing period in the history of Grenada. The most important date is the period of 1795 to 1796, when we had our first revolution. For a year and a half, a very strong-willed mulatto man by the name of Julian Fedon liberated the country from British slavery and colonial rule. Fedon occupied the entire island, except St. George's, where the small administrative corps of British maintained a presence and continued to try to keep control. It took external intervention to overthrow that freedom movement. The British sent reinforcements from other countries, but particularly from Barbados. And with a combined assault, Grenada was recaptured, slavery was reinstituted, and Grenada returned to what was then the normal pattern in the Caribbean, a colony organized according to plantation system and colonial rule. But if we jump ahead from 1795 to 1804, many of the leadership of this popular first successful slave revolt in the Caribbean, many of them were hanged, others were deported. And a fellow by the name of Henry Christophe was deported to Haiti, where he participated in the first standing successful republic of former slaves with the Haitian Revolution of 1804. Of course, with its reoccupation, Grenada languished under slavery until the 1830s, when slavery was abolished and a large peasantry arose. What developed then, as documented by several studies, including M.G. Smith's study on social stratification in Grenada, is a folk which was, according to him, well over 80% of the population, and an elite, about 7%, and a small, developing mulatto and East Indian community in between. The country by then was organized principally as an agricultural exporting economy, and it has remained that, with fishing and crafts, and now, of course, tourism as other social and economic activity. The early 20th century Grenada saw that country become part and parcel of West Indian society. As I said earlier on, the mobilization against slavery, that spirit of rebellion and the search for autonomy and justice and freedom hit the Caribbean full force in the 1930s. And many studies, the British in particular, in an alliance with the American, organized the Anglo-American Commission to understand what the problem was. The problem was a crisis in social development. The withdrawal of monopolies, the withdrawal of preferential treatment for West Indian sugar, these had sparked a social revolt in the islands. Grenada played its part, given to the Caribbean movement a number of very well-known and prominent figures, including Albert Marichaux, who, in his advocacy for one West Indian society, one federated West Indian, as he said, became known as the father of the federation. A federation which was actually formed in 1958, only to collapse in 1962 when Jamaica, in its first referendum on the subject, voted for independence. And the famous equation of 10 islands under a West Indian British Federation, when one pulled out, the saying said 1 from 10 leaves 0. And the federation collapsed. And those who had ambitions for an integrated region would have to wait for a whole generation to pass. The rebellion that had swept the region was a bit slow in coming to Grenada in the 1930s. It didn't arrive until the 1950s, and in 1951, a full-scale revolt erupted in the country again, 150 years later. And this time, as in the first time, it was based in the rural area among those who were most socially or economically disenfranchised. And it was led this time by a rural son of the soil, fellow who had, as had been the practice in that period, migrated to more prosperous regions. Grenadians and others went to build the Panama Canal at the turn of the century, went to cut sugar in Cuba, went to dig gold in Guyana, went to work in the oil industry in Trinidad and in Aruba. Eric Gary was one of those returning immigrants who came to the helm of the popular movement for increases in wages and for social rights. And the 1951 Grenada National Democratic Uprising, as some of the literature refers to it, brought forth some of the rights that had been denied the society as a whole. Full adult suffrage was granted in 1951. Wages were increased by about 50%, and we are talking about very minimum wage here. The color bar was crossed, both by the fact that the leader of the movement, who eventually became an elected political leader, himself, as well as the constituency he represented, were Africans, people who had been the descendants of the Africans who were brought to Grenada and had been enslaved. But Eric Gairy lost his way, lost his nationalist, populist, pro-people's initiative. And after 27 years in office, more or less, he had become a despised, corrupt, ambivalent, and generally unpopular leader. And it took another social movement to organize and bring to the fore what was then the cries and the needs of the Grenadian public. That movement was the New Jewel movement of the 1970s. It was a movement which, after 6 years of popular organizing, of participating in elections, of bringing a multi-class alliance to oppose the dictatorship, seized power through military means on the 13th of March, 1979, and began what has been referred to as the Grenada Revolution. The New Jewel movement governed and built this process for 4.5 years, with tremendous advances and significant problems. In October of 1983, one of the most significant problems, in fact, both the two major problems the revolution suffered, both erupted. One was the lack of the institutionalization of democracy within the process, within the organs of the process, because while there were popular and democratic institutions at the level of people and at the village level, the decision-making apparatus still remained very elitist. It erupted as one group said that the other group was not sufficiently political, not sufficiently revolutionary, not sufficiently socialist. And what resulted was a fratricide, as I call it. One group of revolutionaries massacring the other group, throwing the country into complete trauma, disarray, and pain. The symbol of the revolution, the fellow that the people had come to trust and to love and to follow his direction, was assassinated, Maurice Bishop. I think we have a slide of him somewhere. And the army governed in alliance with some factions of the party. 6 days later, Washington, under the leadership of President Reagan, which had always opposed the process in varying degrees between the Carter and the Republican administrations, invaded, saying that it wanted to save US citizens, to bring order to the political chaos in the country, and to respond to the cry of Grenada's neighbors for support. This invasion, which began on the 25th of October, led into an occupation that lasted about 1.5 years. I'm speaking now about the military troops in the island directing and managing the society. Full 1.5 years. And over the last 10 years, the effect of all of this has been to leave the country caught between perhaps 3 major currents. The old traditional apparatus and lifestyles and ideological and psychological beliefs after 300 years of French and British colonial presence. That's one current, one tendency, one structure, one reality. The other one is the stream I spoke about that began with Fedon and has its most current manifestation in the 4 years of popular people's power. It too has left a very fruitful and conflicted legacy. And the third reality is the reorganizing out of that has been ongoing for the last 10 years, which brings us to the project. We were motivated, or at least I was motivated, to go to Grenada this year so that we would not leave a vacuum when the 10th anniversary came around, and we haven't left it. Here we all are. We wanted to fill the vacuum, not with acrimony, and I suppose not just with the pain that we do feel at this time, but to fill the vacuum with something that was more forward-looking, that grounded itself in an understanding, a love and appreciation for a small country and a grand people, but something that would fill us, the void we have as we continue, as we search for models of education, for ideas to build and develop knowledge and societies. And so I believe that that something interesting had happened in Grenada that shouldn't be forgotten, because it held lessons. It held lessons about development. It held lessons about international relations. It held lessons about the dignity of citizens in this hemisphere. A lot of documentation exists about both the revolution and the post-revolution era, but we felt that we could add to that. And so a group of willing and wonderful and trusting and risk-taking Brandeis students and others joined me on this odyssey to go back home, not solely to go back. They say you can never go home again. I dispute that. But to go back and at the same time to go forward. And so what we did was, or what we intended to do was to reach into the collective memories of the Grenadians and ask them to share with us views and feelings and remembrances and analyses and understandings of what had happened, and to compare and contrast that with where the society was poised today. It was a dialogue we were trying to engage in. And our methodology, very simply, was a qualitative participant observer one. And the classic works on Grenada have used some of these. As I mentioned earlier on, M.G. Smith's Social Stratification in Grenada, which was published in 1965. He stayed 1.5 years and he engaged himself in a series of interviews. Archie Singham's text simultaneously. Time is up. Okay. So we were drawing on the best scholarship that had been done on Grenada before, because we wanted to sort of fall squarely in that, and we used some of that historical understanding of how to study a society, a particular post-colonial society with a particular history, a particular legacy that we wanted to tap into. And so our elements were 4 or 5. First of all, there was a background reading, like all good summer courses. You had to prepare a big package then of readings. And I'm not going to say who read and who didn't read before we went. But that part of the academic exercise was put out. Secondly, we had a series of presentations. We had, in the 6 weeks that we stayed in Grenada, we had a total of 13 different persons present. From community activists, Grenadians with PhDs who had worked overseas, Grenadians who were taught in the high schools, just a wide array of those who had served in the interim council. Our third method was to conduct interviews, both arranged and spontaneous. Our fifth method was to to establish a conversation. And one of the wonderful conversations we had was to report back to the people and get their responses from them. And we have we kept a number of personal journals, and you might be well advised to see whose personal journals you can get to read. I want to close, Sylvia. I know I'm extremely slow and late, and I want to close by just saying to you very quickly. I think the video is on. For what were the responses of the Grenadians? Because we approached this as a collaborative effort. As joint learning, as sharing, and there's about 2.5 minutes of video in which you will see what 3 Grenadians said. You can start rolling. The last one was a member of our delegation, and it's important that the first 2 are educators, and they responded as educators, but I think an important thing happened, which was that even from the young generation, somebody who was from outside, a young Grenadian, even she learned something, and I'm not sure that we expected that kind of learning to go on. So I end with the three views. They're very short. Thank you very much.
Because what has been happening in the past is that the history of Grenada and most of the Caribbean and other countries have always been written by those who are outside looking in, never by Grenadians coming from Grenadians, so it could be documented with the feeling of the Grenadian. And I think what the students have been doing is a dream come true.
I'm very glad that Professor Williams managed to bring this team down, because there's nothing like coming and seeing for yourself. I think that we have to be very careful that we don't get too sentimental about the past. The past is gone. All we have is today and tomorrow, and we have to work towards that. I think also that the youth have to realize that their future is in their own hands and stop looking for Messiah. One of the faults of Grenada is that it constantly seeks Messiahs, and not realizing that each of us is a mini Messiah. We can make it happen. So I hope that with your energy and your feeling, you come back and truly empower the youth. Then we have something dear to my heart, culture, and this is going to be presented by David Kaufman.
I'd like to talk about my work on race and class.
Yes, the next one, please. The last one is a young student, and we'll get her.
Thank you.
Our last presentation is a joint one. First, Kim Holas will present political culture, and then David Kaufman will discuss issues of race and class. Good evening, and thank you for coming. My name is Kim Holas, and before I begin my report, I'd like to share something with you that happened to me last night. Last night during our St. George's reception, I was too scared to stand up and give this presentation myself. But while sitting in the audience, I overheard one Grenadian male clap with somewhat bitter joy when he heard Lisa Louison, a Grenadian, present. I then realized how important it was and how necessary it was for Grenadians to participate in this project, to become engaged. I'm presenting tonight because I feel I have a responsibility to my Grenadian heritage, to my parents and to my grandmother who's here tonight, as well as to myself. So here I am, I'm still scared, but I'm doing it. If my voice shakes, it's because I'm scared. Grenadian political culture is one that is varied. At different times during history, it has expressed itself in different ways, through disengagement, inward gate.
Now we're going to hear from 4 of the students who went down. It was 18 students, is that right, Decima? All right. 17. 4 of them are here with us tonight to give their firsthand report on the project. And they are, and this is the order in which they'll be speaking, Hillary Loring, Stephanie Goldenhirsch, Victor Pontes, and Janice Johnson. Let's start with Hillary.
It's a great honor and privilege to be here and to be part of the Grenada 10 Years Later project. Working with Decima Williams has been exciting and inspiring. I myself am a former high school social studies teacher, but now I'm a PhD student in the sociology department at Brandeis. I am particularly interested in collaborative research and the work of women in development. So this project was really a great opportunity for me because it gave me a chance to work with Grenadian counterparts, to go places and speak with people I would never be able to learn from in any other context. We went to marketplaces, church services, we attended parliamentary debates, we visited homes and schools, playgrounds, and festivals. And in all these places, people welcomed us, wanted to speak with us, and were very open and honest in their discussions and their reflections on the 10 years that have passed since the American invasion. It was also a great opportunity for me to help launch a dialogue that had been needed for a long time. The dialogue between North Americans and Grenadians, and conversations amongst Grenadians themselves. To be part of that, even as an auditor, was a great privilege and an exciting experience, academic experience. As a participant in that initiative, and as a student from North America, I was very interested to listen in particular to what women had to say. Women because the programs of the PRG, the revolutionary government, the development programs were in many cases very supportive and helpful to women and domestic situations. They provided child care, health care, family support of many kinds. And so women had a particular involvement and interest under the revolution. When the revolution collapsed, women, in a way, were one of its primary casualties. And so to engage with them as they look back on where they had been and where they found themselves today was a very interesting and informative exercise for me. All kinds of women spoke to me, young and old, from every walk of life. They touched on some common themes, however, despite this diversity. One of the themes that you heard Professor Williams mention was the trust that came to be among people during the revolution, the looking out for each other, which women feel now is gone. They feel anxiety and fear. Some of them have been subject to harassment when they have sought to join a labor union or to seek advancement at work. One young lady talked about how her family burned her books because they were so afraid that if it were known there were books in the house, somebody would burn the house down. Another theme that emerged was the sense of participation they had enjoyed. They felt commitment from the government under the revolution, and they felt committed to the process of government and civic activism. They contrasted that with how disenfranchised they felt now. The politics did not reflect their interest. It wasn't interested in people or programs that supported people, and they missed it very much. They felt isolated and unable to talk to each other. The third theme I want to touch on is the theme that you heard the speaker the director of Marichaux in the video house, Marichaux House in the video, talk about the leadership, the Grenadians looking for a messiah. Under Morris Bishop's leadership, there was a vision articulated for people of their future and of what Grenada could be. There's a distinct lack among women of any sense of leadership now, or any sense of where Grenada is headed. The desire for an identity is still there, and they talked about this. But instead of looking for a messiah, I think more and more my sense is that women are the missing piece on the scene in Grenada today. Their participation in activism is missing. And if they look to themselves and become involved again, Grenada, they will have a major role to play in Grenada's transformation.
My research in Grenada was focused on something Hillary was speaking about, women's leadership. Part of the reason I chose that topic, that theme, is that I find it inspiring. I always wanted to be the first woman president until I understood what assassination meant. After spending my time doing that research, I seem to be refocusing my academic career around that research, which has made it even more inspirational to me, and I'm seeing it more and more as something that I'm going to continue researching. The comments of women with whom I spoke with in Grenada, as well as from scholars in women's studies and in leadership as a field, are indicative of one very important issue, and it's something that Hillary also mentioned. In order for women to be leaders, there must be women leaders. There has to be somewhere to start, but the picture of a leader must be changed to include anyone, to include someone of any gender and of any race. The influence of having a woman as a leader is what is going to help. Before the People's Revolutionary Government, women leaders were negligible in Grenada. However, during the PRG, there were some women leaders. Jacqueline Kraft was the first woman in the Grenadian parliament, and she noted that the deliberate efforts by the PRG, which is predominantly male, to involve women at all levels of production and defense was a very important aspect of the government. And Maurice Bishop, the Prime Minister, praised women for the growth of their self-respect and dignity, in their self-confidence, in their ability to express themselves. Now, rhetoric or not, the comments that they made helped, because women leaders in Grenada today still credit the revolution for showing them what women can do. Winifred Strawn, who is the leader of the opposition, has a very interesting vantage point. She did not get into politics until 15 years after she had retired. And her comment to me was that she saw her female students become leaders during the revolution, and she discovered what women can do through the eyes of her students. Along with what started these women on paths of leadership, we discussed their experiences as women leaders, whether these women feel their leadership style is different because they are female rather than male, and also the reactions of the community for which they lead, their constituents and the people that they work with, their colleagues as well. By virtue of the experiences of women, most of the women that I spoke with do believe that their leadership styles are different. One woman said that she has a more hands-on, one-to-one approach to people. A male counterpart she feels would end up being a desk manager. She says, my female side has given me a practical approach and an ability to cope. Now, by her female side, she's not talking about genetics. Rather, she's talking about the experience that women have. One of the references was to being a mother and raising a family, especially in Grenada, which is a very interesting society in that it is both matriarchal and paradoxically also very sexist at the same time. These women feel that women as leaders, at least in Grenada, are different, more willing to compromise, or as Winifred Strawn said, stoop to conquer, than men are. She says that men have not been taught that, but have been taught to fight instead. In many ways, these feelings have been perpetuated by the men they work with, by their colleagues. One very extreme example almost brought the Grenadian government to a standstill. In January of 1992, the Women's Steering Committee went to the Minister of Works, Communications, and Women's Affairs, Joan Purcell, with very serious health concerns. There was only one obstetrician on the island of Grenada, and he had passed away. He was replaced by a doctor who was alleged to be on drugs and have AIDS. Soon after the problem was raised, the ministry met with members of the Interagency Group of Development Organizations, the Women's Steering Committee, health professionals, and women in the community to hear concerns about the status of women's health care. Joan Purcell and Ann Alexander, who is the senior official at the Women's Desk, Women's Affairs, met with the Minister of Health and wrote a report containing criticisms of and recommendations for women's health in Grenada. Upon completion, the report was disseminated to the Minister of Health and other ministers. But it was never discussed in Parliament. They were leaving it up to the Minister of Health, and he never brought it up. When Joan Purcell raised the issue in parliamentary session, he walked out. As Ann Alexander explains, he felt we were interfering in his ministry. He was suspended from office, but has since been reinstated. This is just one example of something that women leaders in Grenada and in a lot of other places as well are being faced with every day. A few of the women noted that a woman is allowed to rise as long as you don't threaten, because Grenadian men always see men as a leader and don't take it kindly when a woman is in that role. Women in leadership positions may pose a threat to the stereotype-minded male, but these women also serve as a strong role as models, teachers, and agents for change. Just as Winifred Strawn was empowered by seeing her male students become leaders, young women and girls, and certainly I, gained perspective from the leading women of 1993 Grenada. In seeing these women, it is possible to realize that women can be leaders and that gender is not an issue when it comes to leadership. The women who have taken leadership roles 10 years after the revolution are indeed exceptional. They must fight great odds to acquire and maintain their influence and positions. But without other women coming forward, as Joan Purcell sadly stated, I can't do it alone. We need a brand new vision. Winifred Strawn provided her version of that vision for young women and girls in Grenada today. They must have a lot of faith in God and faith in themselves that they can do things. They must always feel themselves equal to men and not inferior. Aim high and always feel that they can achieve the same educational standard as men. They must see men as co-partners. When asked how the men of Grenada will react and when women take her advice, Ms. Strawn let her cynicism show. She said, but they must do it in a nice, sweet way, because that is the only way it will be taken. What this project meant to me in a lot of ways was, first of all, inspirational, as I said before. But outside of the issue of what I specifically researched, it made me have a different take on world relations. I had never been offended by the use of the phrase third world country until I went to Grenada and really began to question which is the third world and which is the first world. Grenada, during the PRG, the phrase was to go forward ever and backward never. And Grenada has the opportunity to do that. There needs to be some development. It is a developing country. There need to be more women leaders, as they do in many other countries. But Grenada can go forward ever. In the United States, in the first world, in industrialized countries, we have a bigger problem. We've gone forward for a long time, and now we have to figure out a way to plant trees in concrete. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to discuss first how the methodology which we used in Grenada helped, I think, to broaden the experience of the participants. As Decima Williams already spoke about, the qualitative methodology was based on immersion into the Grenadian community as much as possible. For myself, this meant broadening my personal experience, and in addition, this created, for the learning process, a dialogue between Grenadians and North Americans and within the project participants themselves. This dialogue took place both in a formal and an informal sense, formally with guest speakers and interviews, with parliamentarians, economists, union leaders, constitutional lawyers, and informal dialogues from a wide cross-section of Grenadian society, from fishermen, teachers, drug dealers, bus drivers, and agricultural workers. I believe this helped to allow the participants to have a greater idea of the popular perceptions of social and political events and how they have impacted individuals and their society. My focus of study in Grenada was politics and popular perceptions of the politics of the previous three political eras. I'd like to talk now about what those perceptions were. In general, the Grenadians I spoke with seemed very cynical about politics, especially with regard to the three previous political systems. The first, the Gary dictatorship, although many people reminisce about the increased sense of national identity that Gary was able to generate, he was discredited due to his use of repressive measures to maintain political power. The People's Revolutionary Government, although Bishop is widely considered to be a national messiah, and there did seem to be general popular appreciation for the increased social services that the government provided and the sense of internal accountability that the government had. There's some criticism of the government's use of heavy manners, which is repression of its political opposition, the increased militarism of society, and in general, there's a feeling of betrayal that the PRG had a hidden agenda. However, most of this does not affect the perception of Bishop as a national hero. The current government is also was also widely seen as ineffective, based largely on the fact that U.S. and international aid agencies did not give the government the funds it led the constituents to believe would be available. In conclusion, the current government itself is aware of the many social and economic problems that Grenada faces, yet lacks the means, the will, and/or the popular support necessary to come up with dynamic solutions to these problems. The political environment no longer seems to encourage alternate approaches to solving these pressing problems.
I can't sum up what we did in Grenada in 5 minutes, and nor will I try to. What I will try to do is to tell you what I have learned in the process of 5 weeks, having left 1 week early, is why I went to Grenada. First of all, I heard about the project not just from the sociology department or from my friend Flo, but I thought about it and I said, why do I want to go to Grenada? I'm a Jamaican citizen living in America, and I had an interest and a desire to go home, right? One can never go home, that's the statement. But I felt in some way going to Grenada would bring me closer to home. So after about 100 hours of fundraising and a few fights with Professor Williams, I was chosen and I went home. What happened when I got off the plane was interesting to me. I was in the Caribbean. I've never been in any other region of the Caribbean outside of home. And Grenada was not Jamaica. It was not Jamaica in a geographic sense or in the way I suspected that it would be. What it was and what was reflective of Jamaica in me and of being home was the faces of the people. 90% of the people of African descent are black, and that was home. 10% of the people who were not black owed their experience to the African experience, and that made it home to me. And that made Grenada special to me in ways that is difficult to express, especially in now 4.5 minutes. What I did learn is several things about myself. I didn't know so much about myself and yet so little about myself at the same time. I didn't know myself could break down into so many different aspects. There was a self who's a woman, there's a self who's black, there's a self who's Caribbean, then there's a self who's a resident in North America, and of course, there's a self who's a student and the self who's a youth. Now, my project was to define or to explore the idea of youth as a tool of social mobilization. Slow down, right? Okay. So I did all these things, or I thought I could do all these things. The woman in me explored or learned more from the people who were doing it, but also learned socially what it was like for women before, during the revolution, and in Grenada now. The difficult hardships, the hunger, the poverty that women had to go through. To see in these women a woman who will grow up, and what does it mean for me if I wanted to go back home to Jamaica? What are the hardships that I would face? What are the real hardships that I cannot know in 5 weeks and go into Grenada? As a Black person, I recognize that Black people have it real hard, you know, that you never really notice these things. That I remember in 1983, when I heard about Ronald Reagan dropping a bomb on this tiny little island who wants to kill its American citizens in medical school, I thought, good for him. Drop the bomb. Kill the people, because I was ignorant. And it's ignorance that affects me without me knowing. As a Black person, I permitted or I allowed in some aspect of my life the death of other Black people without knowing. And being in Grenada made me a little less ignorant. As a Caribbean, I recognized or I learned more about what it means to be a part of the Caribbean community. What were the impacts of that CARICOM, the Caribbean community, had on what happened to Grenada? You know, how many countries supported the efforts that Morris Bishop, along with Fidel Castro, tried to do for the Grenadian community? How many people in the Caribbean community really knew the fundamental changes that were occurring there? And I was ignorant. As a resident in North America, I realized that being here has its implications, both social, political, economic. My money is being spent here. How much money do I send back home? My social life revolves around what I now call a Jamaican. I'm a Jamaican absorbed with American ideals and ideology. What did that mean, going to Grenada? How many people on the street could see that in my face, in my dress, in my speech? Those things were the things that I could not put a hold on. But after having left Grenada some 2 months later, I can really see these things. As a student, how much reading, how much of the history did I know? A famous person once said, if you do not know your history, you don't know where you're going to, and you certainly don't know where you're coming from. I've never heard of T.A. Marichaud until I stepped foot on that tiny little island. I had never even heard of Fidon. What was Morris Bishop all about? Why did even the average person who was illiterate knew this one word, charismatic? That's not a typical word, that's an SAT word right there. But everyone knew what a charismatic leader was. Everyone knew who he was. As a youth, 65% of the population is under 21 and have made significant strides in their lives. 7,000 people were part of a national youth organization. What organization have I been a part of? What fundamental changes have I made in my life? And those were the things I learned in Grenada. What does this mean for me now that I've told you all these wonderful things about Grenada? What I realize is that I have to step back in some way and contribute some tremendous effort to the fact that Blacks, whether it is Black in North America, South America, Blacks worldwide must recognize and understand the impact of being Black. And that is what I learned in Grenada, that what happens to Blacks in Grenada is reflective of what happens to Black in the middle of Boston, in the middle of Dorchester. There is an economic congruence, there's a social congruence, and we need to know those things. If we don't know those things, then we are somehow disjointed, not linked to what our history and our people are doing, what is happening to them. That we must become a part of the revolutionary process that Morris Bishop spoke of, that Fidel Castro strides for. We must learn what it means to free ourselves of social, economic, and political imperialism. That's what I learned in Grenada. I learned what the structural adjustment program meant and what the implications are. What does the IMF have to do with my life? You know, I never knew what that was before. Why is a structural adjustment program imposed on Grenada if it's been shown historically that it does not work? And I think if anything that I've left for Grenada other than the learning and understanding that forward ever and backward never is that one must learn and one must question.
We have a very short time now to take questions from the audience to the students who went there. And I would like to ask the other students who participated in this Grenada project to come up to the stage. Is that what all these notes were about, Decima? And be here to answer questions and be here for the group picture, I guess. So if you could come up. And we would like to ask anyone who'd like to ask a question to please stand up and come somewhere into the aisle so that we can all hear it, and so that the radio can pick this up. I want to see you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please do.
In my travels around the world, I found that women impressed me more than men. I found they were, especially women in New Zealand. And I wondered why it was that the women had so much more enthusiasm. That's not the exact word that I'm trying to think of. But I'm wondering if any of you could put your finger on why it is that the women are so much stronger than the men.
In Grenada, let's restrict this to Grenada. Was that your experience? Why are the women stronger than the men? More enthusiastic and more with it? Is that sort of what you were saying?
Yes.
This was her impression, and was this their impression of Grenada?
I'd like to just make one comment, and that is, I think that one reason might be that women have to pay attention to what's right in front of them. They have to see the link between what's right in front of them all the time and to be attentive to those things. And they get to think about it and put it together with the larger events that may not be so close. But because men perhaps have their eye on a more distant horizon, they're not quite so aware and so in touch.
I had a comment. I was just thinking of what you said about, I wouldn't make the generalization that women are in general in Grenada even stronger than men, because what happened with us is we heard incredibly articulate, incredibly revolutionary, radical women, and I asked a woman who was revolutionary herself, but why were women, so affected by what happened with the revolution, and how come they spoke so emotionally about it, and hadn't had any men speaking in that same manner about it. And she said, well, that's not true, maybe you didn't hear from these men, but in general, I think the sense that I got that women had a lot more at stake, because this was the first time that they did step forward and they did participate in developing the nation, and that was a tremendous step forward for them. Also, about 60% of Grenada's households are female-headed, so they're the ones who are running the family, they're the breadwinners, primary breadwinners, so that was another reason why, we felt we needed a really strong.
You want to tell us your name?
Monisha.
Any other comments? Do we have any other questions? Can you step forward, please?
Well, I'll stand. I must say, I'm a little bit offended by the tone of a couple of the comments. As a man, I find, just sitting here listening, I just get a feeling of being offended. And I would like to hear, I personally, I think it's great to hear about and to talk about and to focus on the issues and the concerns of and the strength and the activity of women I don't like it when it sounds like it's a put down or when it diminishes men. And I would be interested to hear, I mean, it would be more natural these days to hear a female speaker talk about women, 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 women. And I didn't hear the men on the panel talk about men. And I think that would probably be a lot less acceptable these days. And well, I guess what I'm getting at is, aside from in addition to expressing my feeling, is I'd like to hear about, rather than this sort of categorical statements about women versus men, as it sounds to me, or about men or about women, I'd like to hear maybe a little bit from the man on the panel about men. As you experience them in Grenada.
Do you want to respond quickly, and then maybe we should move on to the next part of the program?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. What specifically do you want to hear?
Well, how did you find the men in Grenada?
I guess I would assume, well, since I'm not a student, I just got here, so that's one of the reasons why I didn't speak up on the panel. But I think one of the main reasons we can have a discussion on men in Grenada is mostly because each of us chose topics before we went to Grenada on different aspects of the of Grenada culture and of Grenada socio-political life, and none of the men chose to study men. Like, so I chose and Victor chose to be political science, and we focused on that issue. I guess it just never occurred to me really to focus on men in Grenada, but and probably more will be discussed about all of Grenada in the next section. So we can probably generalize and talk about Grenada and talk about the men too. So, could you tell us your name, please? My name is Decima Dunbar, and I'm from Williams College.
We're going to have a changing of the guard now and move on to the next part of our program, which is the panel. I thank the students very much. And our panelists will be Decima Williams and Noam Chomsky, who is Institute Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT and a well-known critic of U.S. foreign policy, and they will be having a dialogue, a discussion on the Caribbean and U.S. policy. When the traffic jam in the aisles has cleared.
I have a question for this one.
You want to go first? You want to talk? You want to?
Okay, I'll do whatever you do.
Very short. All right, I'm going to do the envelope part. I have something to say about the beginning and the end, and the long yarns will be woven by no. I'd like to get into this previous discussion, but I think that the dialogue has started, and I'll leave it there. I want to really, before I go further, thank all the students who went, thank their parents publicly, thank Dan Terrace in particular, and thank the provost and the dean who said, yes, this is a good idea. If you speak to Dan Terrace, he'll help you get it together. Gwen Smaxwell, I want to thank all those who gave little money, like a few cents out of their pockets when they were sort of accosted in the Student Center, and I want to thank those who sent in $1,000 checks because they felt passionate about Grenada, and those who gave several $1,000s because they felt passionate about student education of this kind. We raised about $23,000 just in a very short period of time. We got interest, we got support. It's just an incredible beginning for an academic exercise that has a long life to it if we wanted to have that. So thank you all, Brandeis University community, for this initiative effort. The panel on Grenada and in U.S. Caribbean policy, as I said, I think I want to say two things. I want to say essentially that the Caribbean region is a region that is caught up in international relations. Its birth as a modern region is in many ways very much that. But that I want to define it in a way that is not often defined, that we want to shift the understanding of the region from the popular version. And then secondly, I want to say that there are some things in the U.S., and with particular attention to the U.S. public and the U.S. government, that not only can be done differently, but has to be done differently if the Caribbean is to really come into its own. Let me lean on the person of Derek Walcott. This is a man who is now very much in the public eye. He was the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992. He's from St. Lucia. He teaches here in the Boston area. He is somebody whom we have looked to for a lot of words, and he's given us a lot. And I want to use some of what Derek says to launch us into our understanding of the Caribbean. And I'm quoting him from the speech he gave when he received the Nobel Prize for Literature last year. He said, and I quote, "In our tourist brochures, the Caribbean is a blue pool into which the Republic dangles the extended foot of Florida as inflated rubber islands bob and drink with umbrellas floating towards her on a raft. This is how the islands, from the shame of necessity, sell themselves. This is a seasonal erosion of their dignity, that high-pitched repetition of the same images of service that cannot distinguish one island from the other. With a future of polluted marinas, land deals negotiated by ministers, and of all this conducted to music of happy hour and the rictus of a smile. What is the earthly paradise for our visitors? 2 weeks without rain and a mahogany tan, and at sunset, local troubadours in straw hats and floral shirts beating out Yellow Bird and Banana Boat, beating those songs to death." I continue. The Caribbean is not idyllic, not to its natives. They draw their working strength from it organically, like trees, like the sea almonds or the spice laurels of the heights. Its peasantry and its fishermen are not there to be loved or even photographed. They are the trees who sweat and whose bark is filmed with salt. But in every day on every island, rootless trees in suits are signing favorable tax breaks with entrepreneurs, poisoning the sea almonds and the spice laurels of the mountains to their roots. A morning could come in which governments might ask, what happened not merely to the forests and the bays, but what happened to a whole people? This is the morning. This is the morning. What is happening to a whole Caribbean people? I want not to speak just to government policy. I want to speak to us Caribbean people, Jamaicans, and I don't know the word for Grenadian Americans yet. Janice, you'll have to tell me. I want to speak to all those of us who participate in the U.S. society. And to say to you that now, right now, the region faces a dilemma. And I phrase it as such. whether or not we can continue to expand social development in the region, or whether or not we are going to be caught up in the new free market paradigm of development. And that historically these have been contradictory. That the free market or even the protected market of slavery and of early agricultural export and British monopoly over sugar and bananas and so on, that came at the expense of social development, housing for its citizens, health care, education, basic rights. And in fact, it is this schism that has led repeatedly to popular movements seeking to make some bit of a rapprochement between the drive forward on the economic front and the stagnation of the majority. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in Grenada. Though it was begun in one period, it has fallen back. It hasn't changed under Haiti. It hasn't changed in Barbados. It hasn't changed in the Bahamas. It hasn't changed even in Bermuda, which has one of the highest per capita incomes in the world, higher than the US, comparable only with the Middle East, oil-producing countries. And yet, in the region, there is a pool, a large population who cannot meet its basic human needs. The decision, the strategy, the solution out of that is fraught with a lot of considerations of history, consideration of politics, considerations about the ecology, considerations about gender relations and international politics. But that, whether you're speaking to governments today, whether you're speaking to those in the social development activist communities, whether we're speaking to even businessmen, the basic crisis is how to continue to move forward in a way that does not exclude so many people and provoke this, what is called instability. We have everything in the Caribbean, everything. Wealth, poverty, sense of internationalism, colonial history, Miss World. We have a long relation with the US. Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean. Did you know that? Came up here and made his fame. Many of Caribbean-born citizens have gone on to form the Pan-Africanist movement. People like George Padmore have gone on to blast their way onto the American screen, like Marcus Garvey, have gone on to serve in the United States Congress, like Shirley Chisholm, born in Barbados, is now returned as the ambassador to Jamaica, and on and on and on. But I think what is important to note is that despite these visions, these individual and collective success stories, by and large, it's a region that enjoys a relatively high standard of living compared to sub-Saharan Africa, compared to certain parts of Southeast Asia. Yes, very few people starve, very few people die from long-term violence, that's true, but by and large, the structural inability of the region to take care of the vast majority of its people, that continues to be the challenge facing everyone, academics, politicians, activists. What can help? What suggestions can we make to the Caribbean itself and to the US? I want to talk about the suggestions that I want to make to the US, because this is where we are. I want to quote another Caribbean man, my friend. This is a Scotsman. See how we define Caribbean. This is a Scotsman who came to the United States and got disgusted and went to the Caribbean, loved it, married into the Caribbean families and never left. He died not before he sent one of his sons to Brandeis University. Right? Gordon Lewis, I'm speaking about, whose son graduated from the Department of Politics here. Gordon Lewis, who became one of the persons that Pierre speaks about, somebody who came and understood and remained and became. He said, the Caribbean writing in 1985, "Beyond contradiction is on the move. This means that the Americans who visit the region, whether as tourists, businessmen, government officials, or professional experts, must be psychologically prepared to meet the region on its own terms. They cannot come as conquerors or culture carriers or experts with a quick fix. Granted the right attitude, they will find a ready response from the Caribbean, for Antillians share many of the American traits," and he didn't mean North Americans, he mean the whole American continent. "They are warm, gregarious, outgoing, curious to learn, and eager to adapt, but they are fiercely independent." Now, I think given that, and of course the backdrop is not only the Grenada attempt at social and political innovation, but it is also what is happening in Haiti right now, a similar attempt to break out from the 88% versus the 7%, and how that transition is going to be made. And if it is going to be made in a timely fashion so that the whole process doesn't get set back, so that you have 2,000-3,000 people who are massacred, you have the best educated and thinking people, not necessarily in foreign academies, but the most committed individuals sent underground, killed, sent into exile, and the leadership of that society has to be reborn again. That's the backdrop, and I want to leave 3 or 4 messages. First of all, I think not just governments, but everybody must get involved, and I want to applaud the work that universities do, that churches do, that social action groups do, about maintaining a respectful and healthy dialogue, and we need not name them. I think, for example, in Latin American studies, we know of many institutions who have been breaking the embargo on Cuba for many years by bringing up academics and others for dialogue. I want to applaud those who have, in the church community, who have been doing all kinds of humanitarian and support work for some of the poorer countries in the Caribbean. That's important. And by and large, it's been a positive force, bringing medicines, bringing other material supplies, and being advocates for human rights and so on. The challenge of these initiatives is that they should not just remain isolated actions of private citizens. The challenge is how to get this by and large favorable bilateral relationship, respectful, functional, positive relationship. How to get that to become the standing policy of this country. That's the challenge. And that's why I think we all have to be engaged in it. And it's a challenge that we have to think about as we look at the unfolding, I hope, and Noam will tell us whether or not it is not just an unfolding, but a departure in the policies and politics between President Clinton's administration and the struggle that is unfolding in Haiti. So as much as I want to applaud, and I do applaud all the gallant efforts, including our own, I would say, to have dialogue and to understand and to support and to find communion and common ground. What continues to happen in the field of trade, politics, diplomacy, international sporting and cultural exchanges is essentially not just an asymmetrical relationship because you are bigger, you are richer, you are more powerful, but an unfair and unjust and dysfunctional relationship that renders the region unable to satisfy its potential, unable to meet the mandates of its population. And I think there is a different way we can go. And we'll talk about that in question and answers. Thank you.
Noam Chomsky.
Well, the discussion this evening's been mostly about Grenada, which certainly makes sense 10 years after the invasion. Grenada is not the only country in the region that's been invaded recently. Nicaragua has undergone 10 years of terror and slaughter, 30 or 40,000 people killed. Right now there's 100,000 starving to death in the Atlantic coast. There are there are thousands of children starving in the streets of Managua and so on. Guatemala has undergone a sort of an indirect invasion. The U.S. didn't invade it directly. It used international terrorist forces called the Guatemalan Army to slaughter a couple 100,000 people there. The same is true of Panama, was invaded recently. Haiti, if we go a little back a little further, the Dominican Republic's been invaded. Haiti's been invaded, 20 years under American Marine occupation, and full support for torturers and murderers ever since, and that's incidentally still going on, in my opinion. And we can go on and on. We can go to the Philippines, look around the world. We find things very similar. In a way, Grenada is lucky. It only had a brief invasion and occupation. Others have a much more bitter story to tell. And while we can certainly and should look at Grenada and talk about Haiti and talk about Cuba, which is now in the 34th year of an international terrorist war and economic war that the United States has been waging against it, and so on and so forth. We can talk about all those countries, and we should learn about them and find out about their problems. We can't overlook a certain pattern. It all comes from here. It all comes from right here. And as long as this country doesn't change, it's going to stay that way. Now, that's not a new insight. We can trace that insight, if we like, back at least 170 years, probably further. The liberator, as he was called, Simón Bolívar, in 1822, the man who led the liberation of a certain large part of Hispanic America from Spain, pointed out that even if they succeeded in liberating themselves from Spanish and British and French rule, there was a grave menace ahead. Namely, as he put it, at the head of this great continent, there stands a powerful country, very rich, very warlike, and capable of anything. That was quite true. At the time he spoke, the powerful country that he was talking about was busy exterminating its native population and developing the Industrial Revolution on the basis of cheap cotton, thanks to the extermination of the population and the importation of slaves. It then went on to extend its reach further, including finally in 1979 Grenada. The United States, as it happens, didn't have much interest in or concern with Grenada until Maurice Bishop and the revolution of 1979. Now, that was under the Carter administration, you'll recall, the Human Rights Administration, the peak of humanitarianism. The Carter administration was bitterly antagonistic to the Grenadian Revolution from the first minute and reacted exactly the way the United States reacts to all moves for independence. All moves for independence, independent nationalism, no matter what their coloration, whether they're carried out by priests organizing peasants or by democratic capitalists or by socialists or anyone else. It's always the same reaction. It's rooted in, you can find out why. I mean, it's a very free country. We have rich documentary record. It's discussed explicitly. The threat to you in declassified planning documents, which are highly consistent and always tell the same story and lead to policies that are enacted with in a perfectly systematic way. Very hard to find an exception. The threat to our interests is what are called nationalist regimes, which respond to pressures from the masses of their own population for production, for raising of the living standards, and for production for domestic needs. And that's unacceptable because the first priority for the countries is U.S. investors. They must be service areas. They're supposed to provide cheap labor, resources, markets, investment opportunities, these days opportunities for export of pollution and so on. That's the job, be service areas. And if you depart from that job, doesn't matter how or in what way, you will be punished. And this country that Simón Bolívar talked about, which is very rich and very warlike, is indeed capable of anything. And if you look around the region where it's had the power the capacity to exert its power, you find that, Grenada as well as everywhere else. In the case of Grenada, Carter's hostility took the standard pattern. It's always two-pronged, military and economic. The Carter administration immediately began running highly intimidating military maneuvers in the region aimed at Amber and the Amberines, in case anybody didn't get the idea, and Grenada and the Grenadines got the idea. The American press couldn't figure it out and never reported them. The idea was to intimidate and undermine the revolution by forcing it into panic and to try to defend itself and to crack up internally, as finally happened. The economic warfare was instantaneous and brutal. So in August 1980, there was a hurricane which devastated a good bit of the West Indies, destroyed about 40% of the Grenadian banana crop. Grenada doesn't have a lot of resources, and that's rather serious. The Carter administration, of course, refused aid. In fact, at the time, they were trying to block aid from Europe as well. They also refused aid to any West Indian country unless the West Indian countries agreed to cut Grenada out of the aid program. The other West Indian countries refused, and none of them got any aid from the United States. And so it continues. By 1983, Reagan invaded. They were going to turn Grenada into what they called a showcase for democracy and capitalism. That's been done before, too. When the U.S. overthrew the democratic government of Guatemala in 1954, it was going to turn it into a showcase of democracy and capitalism. Same words. And so on in case after case. In fact, the United States poured aid into Grenada. Grenada was the highest per capita aid recipient in the world after the invasion, second only to Israel, which is often a category by itself. But among countries of the world, Grenada was the highest per capita recipient of aid. The result was the usual one, catastrophe for the population, but profits for a lot of people. The society has severely deteriorated. The drug abuse has shot up. The political system has virtually collapsed, and so on. But some things work. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about a year ago which described the terrible economic situation. Even the private sector is complaining about it. But they said that there's one ray of light. Grenada, they said, is the Casablanca of the Caribbean. It has it's become a great center, one of the great centers for drug money laundering, financial swindling of all sorts, and so on. In fact, it has one big growth industry, namely banks. It has one bank for every 64 people, which is the highest, it is the world record. A bank, you know what that means. A bank means a little office somewhere with a fax machine and a telephone and a computer, which is used by the real banks, the ones in New York and so on, for money laundering activities and handling their narco-trafficking operations and so on. So there is one growth area, and apparently a lot of jobs for crooked lawyers and that sort of thing. Well, that's not unique either. Take another country that was recently invaded, Panama, 6 years after Grenada. The idea of the invasion of Panama was to restore to power a tiny elite, the traditional elite of white bankers and narco-traffickers, and that succeeded, and the results were exactly as predicted at the time. The State Department a couple of weeks ago conceded that Panama is now the second greatest center for cocaine money laundering in the Western Hemisphere. Still doesn't come close to the one who has the record, namely the United States, where most of the money laundering is done by the big banks, just as most of the chemicals for production of cocaine and so on are sent from American chemical companies and so on. There are other major drug centers. Haiti, for example, according to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, Haiti is a transshipment point for somewhere between $1.5 and $500 million a year of narcotics, cocaine mostly, from Colombia. The United States government is quite capable of catching every little skiff that takes off from Haiti with a couple of refugees trying to flee, but somehow it's beyond their resources to find the ships that bring $500 million of cocaine in and out. Congressman John Conyers raised some questions about this recently, but never made the press, of course. There was one period when the use of Haiti as a transshipment point stopped. That was a 7-month period from February 1991 to September 1991, when the first democratically elected president took power and cooperated with the DEA, first time there'd been any cooperation, and they, in fact, along with the virtual elimination of terror and atrocities and the beginnings of development, exactly as in the case of Grenada, and applause from the World Bank for laying the basis for future development, again, exactly as in the case of Grenada and other such achievements. There was also a cutback in drug flow, also no refugees fleeing virtually at that time. After the coup that overthrew Aristide in September 1991, things went back to normal. The DEA office was in fact closed down after death threats from the military. It's now back, but apparently not functioning. And we can proceed. This is a very regular pattern. It's not that the U.S. likes drugs, it's that it likes rich bankers and chemical corporations and investors and so on, and they happen to like drugs because they make a lot of money from it, so that these consequences develop. The structural adjustment programs are imposed on Grenada, but not Grenada alone. There are 76 countries that have had structural adjustment programs in the past 10 years. It's a little misleading to say they are imposed as if there is no agent. They are imposed by someone, namely the people who run the international lending institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, and they're in Washington. Even rich, big countries take their orders from Washington. So take, say, India, not a little country. The Indian press recently has pointed out, the Indian economic journals, that it's pointless to read planning programs of the government of India, because you might as well just read the orders that they got from the World Bank and the IMF in Washington a couple of months earlier, and that's the government planning program. In fact, the press has pointed out that the Indian government planning documents are now written with American spelling and American style instead of the British spelling and the British style that comes automatically to Indian bureaucrats because of the place where they're written from. Well, structural adjustment programs have their consequences. They're called failures, but that's a little bit misleading. One of their consequences is to sharply reduce the share of labor in national income. So the labor costs go way down and wages go way down, but that means profits go way up, mostly profits for investors. So take, say, Haiti, which has been a darling of Washington, of the business community, right through the worst terror and torture of the Duvaliers and so on. The Haiti was going to be turned into what U.S. aid called the Taiwan of the Caribbean, and it was going to do it by using its great advantages in cheap labor. And in fact, U.S. programs helped create a very substantial labor pool. They're forced, like everyone, to pursue agro-export programs, which means purchase U.S. agricultural exports from here, and you stop producing for your own population, and you produce for export. That drives lots of people off the land, creates a big labor force. U.S. aid moved in with lots of investment programs, to encourage investment, to encourage U.S. Investors to move their assembly plants over to Haiti, and they advertise the terrific advantages. You can get plenty of people to work, for mostly women, incidentally, for 14 cents an hour, and there's no unions because you smash them up pretty quick. Under this program of turning Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean from 1980 from about 1980 to 1988, real wages declined about 56%. The same thing happened in the Dominican Republic, same thing happened in Mexico, about 60%. These are what are known as economic miracles. The population starves and the investors get rich. So the programs are a success. They're a success in doing exactly what they're intended to do. Again, there's nothing new about this. You can read about it in Adam Smith, to mention a famous revolutionary. He pointed out that the British were doing exactly that in the late 18th century, then in Bengal, imposing programs that were impoverishing and destroying the population while enriching the merchants and manufacturers who were the principal architects of the policy in England. And now we're doing it and doing it on a massive scale. In the case of in the case of Haiti, as soon as the Aristide government took over, the U.S. Moved instantly to total hostility, exactly as in the case of the Bishop government in Grenada. Aristide was elected. It was a huge surprise. The United States expected that its own candidate, a former World Bank official, would easily win the election. He had all the resources and so on. He got 14% of the vote. Aristide was elected with 2/3 of the vote on the basis of a big popular movement, grassroots movement that nobody really knew was there except Haitians, and it sort of came out of the woodwork and swept him into office. The U.S. reaction was exactly the same as in every other such case, instant hostility. U.S. aid terminated all of its investment promotion efforts when Aristide tried to raise the minimum wage to 50 cents an hour, a magnificent 50 cents an hour. U.S. aid strongly opposed that. They refused to give a penny to any of the popular movements, including the huge peasant movement. Haiti is peasants. Money went only to the business community. The U.S. government instantly began a character assassination attempt against Aristide. The ruling generals, General Cedras, was handing out to reporters a 200-page dossier of alleged crimes of Aristide right away. Meanwhile, the State Department was telling reporters, well, why don't you check with the ruling generals? They'll tell you about Aristide. And they knew all about it because they had given Cedras that 200-page document. And they have since been leaking all sorts of ludicrous stories about Aristide. The most recent were last week or a week or two ago on CBS. Maybe you saw them, about a CIA profile that shows he's really a madman and so on and so forth. This is absolutely standard, and it's a prelude to the Clinton administration's programs were not identical to the Bush administration programs in Haiti. They were harsher. As Clinton was capturing refugees, and Bush was taking refugees from Haiti and sending them off to Guantanamo. Clinton, as soon as he moved in, harshened that program. He put a blockade around Haiti and forced them right back on the grounds that they were not political refugees, but economic refugees. He could tell that by ESP or something. So therefore, he sent them right back. Putting a blockade around Haiti is, of course, totally in violation to international law, but the United States is an extremely lawless society. It pays no attention. It's as if Libya interdicted all air traffic out of the United States, if you can imagine that. There is a program to restore Aristide, but watch it carefully. You can predict exactly the way it's going to go, and if you look at the small print, you can see it precisely. We have to put ourselves forward as the great lovers of democracy. And it just wouldn't look nice if somebody who won an election with 2/3 of the vote and was thrown out by a bunch of brutal gangsters is just killed or left outside and so on. So the idea is to get Aristide back in some fashion, in some cubicle somewhere, where he is deprived of any power whatsoever. That's crucial. That's the bottom line. It's not a big secret. You can read about, for example, America's Watch, the main human rights organization, about 8 or 9 months ago, had a report on what was going on in Haiti, and they pointed out quite accurately that while the United States is sort of standing by and watching, the military in Haiti are destroying what they called Haiti's remarkably advanced popular political organizations, referring to Lavalas, the grassroots organizations, and its vibrant political culture, and they're going to destroy it so fully that if Aristide ever gets back, there'll be no organized popular support left for him to implement any programs. Aristide was forced, and I mean forced, like orders, to throw out his prime minister and accept a new prime minister who is acceptable to the Haitian business community. Now, actually, the new prime minister is a decent person and a courageous man, Robert Malval, but as the press hastens to point out correctly, he's opposed to Aristide's populist reforms. That's crucial. We've got to take things back the way they were. That's, of course, not the end of it. If you read this morning's paper, you'll notice that the latest proposals now being floated, in a couple of days or weeks they'll be implemented, is to have, if they can get Aristide back, maybe on the back of an American invasion, they will put him off in a corner. They already have, as prime minister, someone opposed to his populist reforms, but now they'll have to broaden the cabinet, to broaden it to include representatives of the military and the ultra-right and so on. Then we'll have real democracy. With the popular movement that brought Aristide into power demolished and destroyed, power in the hands of the old business community, and now broadened to include the most extreme thugs, and that'll be called democracy. Meanwhile, the U.S. intends to send in trainers to train the military and police trainers to train the Haitian security forces in more humane behavior. That is more humane than carried out by Chief of Staff, Army Chief of Staff Cedras and the Chief of Police Michel Francois, both of whom, incidentally, received their training in Fort Benning, Georgia, presumably at the School of the Americas. But they apparently didn't learn well enough, so now some of the same trainers are going to come back to teach them how to do it a little better, the way they trained the people in Guatemala and so on. According to church sources around Aristide and from Haiti, members of the high command in Haiti have been trained have been in the United States for training as recently as early October this month. I can't prove that. I can just say that that's what they say. Now we're going to go in and train them exactly the way we've trained every killer and murderer throughout the hemisphere. Well, you know, we can proceed with Cuba. Same with Haiti, incidentally. Yeah, I'll stop. In Haiti, there's much too much to talk about, and besides, it's all the same story anyway. You know, in Haiti, our relationship to Haiti does not begin in 1979. It begins in 1791. We have a long relation with Haiti. When the Haitian slave revolt began, the U.S. sent troops and money to try to put it down. The United States was the last country in the world to recognize Haiti in 1862. Happened to be the year we recognized Liberia, and for the same reason, at that point, the U.S. was going to free the slaves, and we therefore had to get them out of the country somehow. We had to create what Thomas Jefferson called a country free of blot or mixture, meaning you exterminate the native population, so no reds, and you somehow kick out the black population, so no blacks, and then we have a country free of blot and mixture. And therefore we recognized Haiti and Liberia as places which we were going to send these guys. Haiti was occupied for 20 years, first by Wilson's Marines, who destroyed the place, and then they left it pretty much the way it is. Cuba has been under attack from Cuba, when Simón Bolívar made those statements about the country at the head of the hemisphere, exactly at that moment, Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams and others were working out plans for eventual invasion and occupation of Cuba. They intended to take it. The British fleet was in the way at the time. As soon as the British fleet as that deterrent was overcome, the United States did conquer Cuba in the guise of liberation, turned into a plantation and a haven for rich tourists and for gamblers and gangsters and so on. Everything was fine until 1959, when the Castro Revolution took place. Within months, Cuba was under military attack from Florida. You know, planes were taken off from Florida and bombing Cuba. In March 1960, the Eisenhower administration formally determined, in secret, it's now declassified, to overthrow the government. Kennedy came in, invaded, launched the biggest terrorist war in history. He was a complete maniac about Cuba, not only about Cuba, but other things. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy tried to organize Latin American support for another attack. It didn't work. The reason was given by a Mexican diplomat who said, if I tried to claim that Cuba was a security threat, 40 million Mexicans would die laughing. Well, fortunately, we're more sober here, so nobody died laughing in Harvard Square when they made the same claim. And so it goes right up to the present. After the transition from Bush to Clinton, in fact, right at that transition, under Clinton initiative, the embargo against Cuba was tightened. There's no longer any pretext about the Russians. We dropped that one because they're not around anymore. The embargo against Cuba was tightened. That's the Torricelli bill, called the Democracy Enhancement Bill. Robert Torricelli is a liberal Democrat. Bush wanted to veto it, but under pressure from Clinton, who was outflanking him from the right, he approved of it. Incidentally, Torricello's delicate sensitivity for democracy is revealed by the fact that he was opposed to the embargo against Haiti because he said Aristide didn't really reach his high democratic standards. He can't see any difference between Aristide and the gangsters and killers who were torturing and murdering. These are very subtle discriminations. Time is up, and in fact long was up, so I'll stop. But the conclusion is glaringly obvious. Simón Bolívar was exactly right. And until we learn what he had to say and do something about it, the story's not going to change.
Yes. Whoever gets to this point first, that's the first question.
I would like to ask a question on the issue of structural adjustment that both of you have talked about. I know it's a big issue. The problems of the World Bank and the IMF are causing to not only the Caribbean countries, but to the African countries as well. And we know that probably after Haiti, there will be another case in which the IMF and the World Bank and the CIA as well will be involved. My question is this. So many people are defining this as a new order, new world order phenomenon. What is your description of that new order phenomenon with regard to the structural adjustment? What do you think that the Caribbean countries and the African countries should do to defend themselves from this new phenomenon, whatever the phenomenon is? What is your description of that?
You first.
Me. Well, structural adjustment is actually not a new policy. It's a new version of an old policy. The policy, in fact, was described by Adam Smith and goes back to the 18th century, and we've been, plenty of experience with it. The idea is, at the core, it's very simple. We try to impose market discipline on countries that we're trying to destroy, while, of course, no wealthy country, no developed country would ever accept market discipline for itself. The reason why the United States is a rich country, and England is a rich country, and India is an impoverished country, and Egypt is an impoverished country, and right up till the present, is that there was enough force in the hands of England and the United States to radically violate market principles themselves, so that therefore they were able to develop, and to impose them on subject populations, which were about as developed as they were, like India and Egypt, so therefore they would underdevelop. So under British, you go back to the 18th century, India was roughly like England in terms of industrial development. In fact, and Britain had to set up high protective tariffs to keep Indian textiles out. In fact, India was producing ships for the British Navy. Well, Britain had the force. So India underdeveloped and ended up being a completely impoverished agricultural country, and England developed. And the same is true of the United States, and the same goes right up to the present. There isn't a single country in history that has ever developed by following market principles. Every single one of them, crucially us, developed by radically violating those principles. Now that's why, and we continue to be extremely protectionist. The things we call free trade, like NAFTA, are usually protectionist, as NAFTA is. On the other hand, we have to impose market discipline on the poor, because then they'll be completely open to Western robbery, robbery by the rich. And that's the modern version of that is structural adjustment. So for example, and its effects are very plain. So for example, during the 1980s, the flow of capital from the south to the north, poor countries to the rich countries, ran to roughly $500 billion in debt service alone. It's debt service alone. It's a fraction of the whole. That's about the equivalent of 6 Marshall Plans in today's dollars. That's from countries like sub-Saharan Africa to, the United States and England and France. In fact, by now, the success stories of structural adjustment that the World Bank likes to hail, like Ghana, for example, are exporting capital even to the lending organizations, not just to the West, but to the lending organizations themselves. Well, that's the way you control people. The IMF just announced its new programs for Nicaragua just 2 weeks ago. Nobody ever reports it here, of course, front page news there. IMF means Washington. That's where they get their orders from. The new programs to Nicaragua are reduce the national debt to 0. Okay, if the United States had to do that, you'd be wiped out tomorrow. Privatize everything. meaning like water. So for example, if poor people, which is about 80% of the population, can't pay their water bills, their children die of dehydration. That's very important to achieve that. Cut down, stop all credits from the National Bank. Okay, so like no credits to bean farmers, for example. Cut off $60 million from social expenditures, which means to eliminate essentially what remains of the health and welfare programs. We've got to destroy all of those. The $60 million, incidentally, was probably picked because of its symbolic significance. You really like to torture people properly. Some of the banks have already been privatized. And last year, the privatized banks exported $60 million to the United States. For reasons that any economist can explain to you. That's the efficient use of resources. Much more efficient to play the New York stock market than to give credits to poor bean farmers. So in fact, they lost their bean harvest. Well, that's structural adjustment. Now, of course, it's true that in the case of, say, Cuba and Nicaragua, we have special reasons for torturing them. Not just that we have to return them to their former status, but we have to teach a lesson to the third world. And the lesson is well understood in the third world, not understood here, because in our well-insulated, deeply indoctrinated society, we refuse to see obvious things. But in the third world, it's understood. The lesson is you stand up to the enforcer, and you don't only get crushed, but you get destroyed, and for a long time to come. Any mafia don understands that perfectly well. Okay, that's structural adjustment.
But I think this lesson you say is not accepted by the populace. It's not accepted by the popular forces. Most citizens know very well that structural adjustment is not in their interest, and there are interesting ways in which they are fighting it. I can't speak for the whole world, although it has been imposed on virtually 100 countries in the developing countries during the 1980s. In the Caribbean, what we see is that other systems, what has been called, for example, counter-plantation systems, have become very vibrant again. The informal sector, and a lot of these are initiatives by, small producers, a lot of women, a lot of people with, minimum or average levels of skills. And what people are doing is saying, before the state exits me, before the state would take me off the payroll, cut back social services, and so on, I need to find an alternative. So they begin more vegetable production. They look for alternatives. It doesn't always support whole families, and that's why you see what we saw in Grenada, which is a crisis within the communities, because social development just isn't going on. But people are surviving, and as I said, in the Caribbean, there are 2 or 3 different ways. One is, because we have relatives in the United States and Canada, people are trying to immigrate. And that's part of what, is called the boat people. I mean, people don't want to leave their countries, but they are forced to leave. That's one response. Another response is that citizens are not, as I said, not looking for jobs, because there are no jobs in the government. The government is shrinking. So they're finding cooperatives, they're doing community development. We have, again, very specific examples, the case of grain fruit production in Grenada, where women form a cooperative and they produce for the domestic market fruits and vegetables and so on. And it isn't really the answer. I believe that the long-term answer is to have an economic system that responds to the social needs of the majority of the population. But in the interim, people are fighting it, and some people are doing well, but the vast majority are not. And so I think the structural adjustment program has to come to an end.
I'm Brian Billing, a member of the International Socialist Organization. I want to make 2 comments and then ask a question of both the speakers.
Speak up further.
Okay. One is, I'm glad that Noam Chomsky stressed the continuity between the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and also went back to Carter's policy towards Grenada, because I think it's important that people come to terms very quickly with what the Clinton foreign policy is. You see, it was Clinton that turned away, that was elected on the basis of lifting the ban on HIV immigrants and so forth, allowing Haitians into the country with political status, and he reversed himself almost, actually after the election, but before he took office. You also see Clinton's trying to increase the number of U.S. troops that are being deployed in Somalia. Over 1,000 Somalis have already been killed at the hands of UN and U.S. forces there. And I think it's important that people wake up to what the Clinton administration is all about. the question I have for both of you, and I think it's also important, is how do you see the role of the United Nations in the post-Cold War order? Because I think it's very important. The U.S. is going into Somalia, for instance, under the cover of a UN humanitarian mission. It's very quickly unraveled and been shown to be about something else. And I think the question of the UN is important for people.
I think in the 1980s in particular, as the United Nations was more and more responsive to the agenda from the South, the new International Economic Order, the new Information Order, the United Nations Development Program, UNESCO, UNICEF, these social agencies and social arms of the UN were very effective in one of the goals of the United Nations, which is to support development and well-being. As that happened, the Reagan administration in particular seized upon some of these agencies like UNESCO and mandated that these agencies withdraw from charging that some of them were corrupt, that they were not carrying out the mandate of the UN, which was to practice security rather than development. And this kind of attack is, which was started in the 80s, is continuing in this new era, where I think the United States, and this is not just the presidency, but I think the larger political apparatus, many of whom are very vocal in the Congress, would prefer to see a UN that is under the control of the US. And that's the struggle, I think, that is going on.
Well, I would just change the dates a little. The UN, of course, the United States is overwhelmingly powerful. I mean, nobody's in the same league. We basically run the world. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the US power was so enormous that the UN was just an agency of the United States. And at that time, the UN was very popular in the United States. It was a great force for peace and so on and so forth. In the 1950s, with decolonization and with the reconstruction of other industrial countries, the UN fell under what was called the tyranny of the majority, sometimes known as democracy. Under the tyranny of the majority, of course, the United States turned hostile to the UN. And by the mid-60s, start from around the mid-60s up until today, the United States has basically been trying to destroy it. So take a look simply at Security Council vetoes, which I've done. Incidentally, I have this in books if you want to look at it. The U.S. is, since the late 60s, the U.S. is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. Britain second, France a distant third, and the Soviet Union fourth. The technical term for this is that the Soviet Union and the shrill third world voices were disrupting the UN. That's the way it's depicted in the press. Votes in the General Assembly are the same. You know, votes like 150 to 1 or 151 to 2 and so on and so forth. All of this is on a whole range of issues: observing international law, aggression, human rights, disarmament, in fact, the full range of issues. The UN was simply of no use any longer, and therefore the US wanted to destroy it. It's of no use. This reached a peak with the efforts of UNESCO as a particular irritant because it was concerned with the third world, and that's finished. UNESCO has given up. They don't do much for the third world. Same with UNCTAD. The UN had a commission looking into transnational corporations, which are of supreme importance in the modern world. That was just disbanded, finished. We don't want any of that stuff. In the last few years, world changes have taken place of the kind that you know about that have, again, increased U.S. dominance, and by now the UN is once again essentially an agency of the United States. The third world is absolutely devastated, mostly by the catastrophic failures of capitalism in the 1980s, which has wiped out most of the traditional colonial domains. Whatever you think about the Soviet Union, however horrible they may have been, their existence created a certain space for non-alignment and independence. Their disappearance, meaning their return to the third world where they came from, which is what's going on now, is eliminated that space, and it has left the third world completely open to U.S. attack. It's not that they're unaware of it. They are aware of it. So one of the leading Brazilian theologians, Cardinal Arns, pointed out recently that throughout the whole South, he said, there is hatred and fear. When are they going to invade us, and on what pretext? That's about right.
Yes, but that is...
And now the UN is a favorite again because of doing what we tell it.
I agree with you, Noam, but I don't think that's the only sentiment in the South. I mean, that gets played up a lot. There's a tremendous that we are desperate, that we are frightened, that we have lost our hope. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union, whatever role it played, has left us feeling very vulnerable. I agree with you entirely. But you know what? I think we have to start looking in other places for sources of power. Right, and it might take a long time to really emerge. And this is, I'm coming back to my question.
You should look somewhere else.
Yeah, and that in the smaller places, among the places where there is no big spotlight, that's where it's happening. And I want to suggest that, in fact, the thing to do here in the U.S., I'm trying to answer my question I posed earlier. How do we get all the successful, progressive, wonderful pieces of ways in which this North interacts with the South? How do we get that to be the major pattern of behavior? I think it rests with people here. I think it rests in, with what you do with the U.S. society. And simultaneously, how do we recover in the South from the long-term colonial and imperial affront that we have been facing? Well, I think we have to continue to do the kinds of things that they're doing in Haiti, to say that despite the fact that we are uncertain of the future, we are going to stand up and put forward our agenda, and it has a cost. So it's very important to know that it isn't hopeless. In other words, I think optimism and courage and small initiatives are very important to keep in the face of the big, massive assault, because the U.S. is powerful, but it's not all powerful. It's not out there alone. It's even fighting now with Japan and Western Europe. The United States, for example, needs the Caribbean. You have a positive balance of trade with the Caribbean, whereas you're fighting to get a good trade balance with the Japanese and the Europeans. So, in other words, there's a book somebody wrote called the weak. The weak is not powerless. Even the weak has something to contribute. And if we perceive ourselves as weak, I want us also to perceive ourselves as having power, including you, Noam.
Well, see, I quite agree that we should conceive ourselves as having potential power. We should be realistic, but we should be realistic means face reality. Reality is that right now, the United States is in a position to exert its traditional historic agenda in most of the third world, and that's what we're seeing happen. Now, as long as the United States doesn't undergo a quite significant internal transformation, people in Haiti and Grenada and Nicaragua and other places are not going to be able to withstand that power. That's going to require substantial changes right here. How much hope we have is a kind of personal matter. That's what you should dedicate yourself to.
I want to agree with what Decima Williams said earlier about the U.S. Not seeing the U.S. as being all-powerful. And I think what's happened in Somalia proves that. I think that whatever you think of idea of the warlords in Somalia, they've made it less likely that the U.S. will intervene as quickly somewhere else in the world. And therefore, I think you have to point.
I just think that's a complete misinterpretation. I mean, Somalia was a totally marginal issue for the United States. They wanted a little Pentagon PR. It got unpleasant, so they pulled out.
Yeah.
We're really running out of time.
Yeah,
I want to get to the people behind you. One last question. And because then we can continue the discussion over food outside in the hall.
I really want to draw on what Decima said about it not being totally hopeless, because I agree with everything you said in your analysis, and always have, as I think all clear-thinking people must. There just aren't that many of us that are able to survive the onslaught of the American-controlled media. But the hope lies precisely. C.L.R. James said that every major movement and development in the world since the, quote, New World came into being has begun in the Caribbean, and that the Caribbean has spawned so much, and I think it's spawning the response. It spawned it in Nicaragua, and that people's movement is not dead. It spawned it in Cuba, and whatever they do, the genuine revolutionary movement that began there will not die. And it spawned in Haiti. And on a very specific note, with regard to Aristide returning next week, Aristide, if he returns next week or next month, I think you're selling him short and the Haitian government short. They are aware of everything you've said, and we know, and all of us who support the Aristide government know, how difficult it is and how unlikely it is. But there is the glimmer of hope. There is the possibility that Clinton may just be that much more bumbling than Bush, and that Aristide and his government are shrewd negotiators.
and that they may be able to overcome. And much more important than that, there is a genuine, powerful, grassroots, intelligent movement in Haiti, the Lava Lust movement.
Well, I was in Haiti.
Is that we have to respond, as you said, and as Nesma said, we have to start the Lava Lust movement here.
Yeah. I mean, I was in Haiti not too long ago, and indeed there was a very rich and vibrant movement which is now cowering in terror. The Aristide government certainly has hope, but they're not going to be able to implement that hope unless we do something. I mean, if we sit there and say, look, maybe they'll be able to outfox Clinton, you can predict exactly what's going to happen. If we do something to change U.S. policy, then there's hope.
Well, we better do it fast. We better do it fast.
In Haiti, we better do it very fast because it's a matter of weeks.
Last one. This guy has been trying for a month.
Questions for Professors Chomsky and Williams.
In that order.
In regards to Grenada and Panama, respectively. Are there still U.S. occupation troops there? And what is the nature of those troops? Like, are they armored? Are they infantry? Are they signal corps, psych op, administrative, or what?
I'll go first and talk about Grenada. I think the 6,000 troops landed, 10,000 stayed in the ships in the Grenadian waters, and 300 Caribbean police joined them as a symbolic support. I myself went back to Grenada at that time and was effectively chased out of the country 7 days later. I was interrogated by U.S. police. I was detained by U.S. police. My house was under guard by U.S. military police. In other words, I know what I say when I tell you about the occupation, and I know that some others have tried to say, look, the U.S. had to go in because the Cubans were there and they had to keep them calm, and the Caribbean and Grenadians took control of the country. This is absolutely not true. The main agenda was, in terms of long term, was to put into place a new security apparatus. And as Chomsky has said, this is an old pattern. In fact, in 1984, Philip Nicolaides from one of the conservative groups wrote a fundraising letter, which was distributed widely to help raise money to install the government that actually came in 1984 with U.S. support. And in that letter, the lines actually said, give to this campaign so that we could help finish the job our Marines started. What a poke in the eye it would be if those whom we overthrew were able to come back in some other form through the elections. So that the idea was to make sure to consolidate a certain kind of agenda in the post-invasion period. And the security apparatus is very important. I cannot itemize now the sorts of things that went on. The detentions, the arrests, the wide array of violations of human rights. It took a year and a half for it was called the SSU, the Special Security Unit. And they were trained from all the small islands, and many times in the last 10 years, they have been deployed. And I'll give you one incident and shut up. Just before the election, and one of the left parties was contesting the elections, there was a rumor that the revolutionaries and those who had been put in jail would be sprung from jail. The Grenada government invited all the security apparatus from the other Caribbean countries to come in and keep security in Grenada. That's how the system is working now. If there is a fear in Antigua, all the troops go there. If there's a fear in St. Vincent, all the troops go there. At the moment, when I was last there in August, there is a physical presence. There's a base right next to the U.S. Embassy in Grenada, and they continue to train. I'm not sure if it's just police or if it's army as well, but there is U.S. military training ongoing in Grenada now.
Well, just to mention, Panama, of course, Panama is flooded with U.S. troops, and there's a major base in the Canal Zone right next door, which is one of the major U.S. bases. It's the base of SOUTHCOM, Southern Command of the United States. It's also recognized. You can read it in quite mainstream conservative journals, if you like. For example, Current History, which is, sort of standard political analysis journal, in their most recent article, issue on the Caribbean, the article on Panama points out that by January 1991, The Bush administration already understood that the so-called democratic government, that is the government it had put in power, couldn't withstand the Panamanian population unless U.S. troops defended it from the population. And they'll stay there. Now, what Decima said is exactly right. It's been every imperial power, including the United States, has always much preferred to rely on local mercenaries called security forces. So the British, when they ran India for 200 years, they didn't use British troops. There was a thin scattering of British troops. They used 90% of the British troops holding India were Indian sepoys, usually brought from one area of the country to another, that sort of thing. And that's the standard system. The U.S. does it all the time. It's been official U.S. policy since the mid-1940s, now declassified, that we must gain control over the security forces in the countries of the Western Hemisphere. If we have control over the security forces, it doesn't matter much what happens in the civilian society, for obvious reasons. This reached a peak under the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy intellectuals, the Cambridge liberals, were much more insistent than anyone before in ensuring U.S. control over the security systems. And in fact, that led to a vast plague of repression over Latin America as country after country fell into the hands of neo-Nazi murderers, beginning with Brazil and running right through the 80s. And that remains the case today. Part of the U.S. antagonism to Nicaragua, incidentally, is that although the U.S. has pretty much what it wants, it still has not taken complete control of the security forces. That's what's called Sandinista control of the security forces, meaning you can walk around Nicaragua, unlike most countries of the region, without being terrified if you see a soldier or a policeman. Well, we got to change that. They've got to be under U.S. control, and then you can have any kind of government you like. But that's just our version of traditional imperial policies.
I think that
the faction, this is a question about the fratricide that took place in Grenada. And what I'd like to ask about that is, what evidence is there, if any, for the kind of CIA or covert manipulation of whatever was going on there that intensified that? But apart from that, what was it that was going on independent of CIA or whatever manipulation, and what might have been done differently in the way in which the revolutionary project was being brought, was evolving, that might have lessened the possibility for that kind of, those differences of opinion to lead to the result?
I can't answer all of that. I'm writing a book on it. But what I can say to you is that the pressures from the hostility of both the Carter policy and the Carter administration and the Reagan administration created tensions inside. There's no doubt about that. I'll say to you that it will take quite a while before, if ever, the records of both administrations become available to the extent that we could understand the role of all these different agencies, including the DIA and the CIA. I don't have the answer to those records or access to those records now. And thirdly, I would say that internally, I think all political institutions, and it seems particularly true of revolutionary movements, have to resolve a number of variations on the theme of revolution, if you will. And it takes a while to have some understanding of, and common agenda, one program that is viable within the social and cultural context of the country. Noam will tell you how this happened in the case of the American Revolution and so on. In our case, we had those normal, traditional kinds of political dialogue. What is abnormal is that it led to such a crescendo and such a hatred and such a pitch. And that is unexplainable. And that is why many analysts are suggesting that it wasn't simply an honest and straightforward political difference of opinion that happens in any party, but that there must have been other kinds of crescendo in instigations like you had, say, for example, in the Black Panther Party and so on. But to date, we have no evidence of it. But I want to close by saying that there's just a tremendous amount of fresh and healthy rethinking and good energy in the country, in Grenada. and throughout the region. A lot of it comes from the fact that we have a long popular movement in the trade union. We're not afraid to think revolutionary. I mean, we have had Cuba there as an inspiration, despite its problems now. We don't want to see it collapse into a big bloodbath. We don't want to see that in Haiti. And there's a high, good, positive energy. And I want to bring that message to Brandeis and to the United States and to say that even though we don't have a big economy and we don't have a lot of arms and ammunition, there's something there that if you talk to the students who went, they may have captured part of that, and that is our hope, that we believe in the future, we believe in ourselves, and that we are willing to try and try and try again, until we get it right. So if these efforts can be supported by a healthy policy, I think that's in the interest of the region as well as in the U.S. We do, what Noam says is true. We don't need foreign aid. What is foreign aid? It's a recycling of corporate dollars in the South. And in the Caribbean, we sent more capital to the north in the same period that we are supposed to be getting foreign aid. So it's a very convoluted picture that you are given here, and I'm glad that we get this chance to talk a little bit about what, really is not so much the truth, but our truth.
Thank you. Why don't we close here?
I want to thank you. Thank you very much. I didn't want to spend October alone.
These guys who do this torture somehow have, like, for instance, Mitrione had 9 kids. How the hell could they live?
No, how the hell can faculty members at MIT and Harvard live when they're smart enough to figure out that what I said, 100,000 people are dying in northeast Nicaragua because of policy.
Excuse me, the lapel mic, the Sony?
It's in the back on top of my jacket.
How can they live knowing that 11 million children are dying every year because they won't give them 3 cents for a book?
It's amazing.
How did the Germans live? Look, you take Nazi Germany. I mean, Hitler, the Holocaust was probably supported by maybe 5% of the population. I mean, everybody sort of knew about it, but they pretend that, you convince yourself that you don't have to do it some other way, so you do something else.
Well, a conservative friend, well, he's not really a friend because we always argue, but a conservative person that I know said that if people in Poland had just gone, yell outside their windows, look, just stop what you're doing, stop messing with these people, stop arresting the Jews, and that would have been enough. That's what I told them too. Yeah,
they would have been killed too. But in a country like this, it would be enough. So at least, the Nazis, you can at least, they have an excuse, fear. We don't have an excuse.
I agree, 100%. Well, I'll let you go.